Good afternoon, and welcome to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation Meet the Scientist monthly webinar series. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein, BBRF's President and CEO. Today, Dr. Blair Simpson will present Transforming Treatment Outcomes for People with OCD. BBRF is the world's largest private funder of mental health research grants supporting transformative discoveries in order to develop improved treatments, cures, and methods of prevention. The high quality of the research we fund is made possible by the BBRF Scientific Council. This group of 192 prominent mental health researchers reviews each grant application and selects the most promising ideas with the greatest potential to lead to breakthroughs. The Scientific Council guides the foundation to fund creative and impactful basic, translational, and clinical research relevant to the whole spectrum of mental health. One reason that research funded by BBRF has had such a great impact is because we do not limit our focus to one illness or condition. Since 1987, the foundation has awarded $462 million to fund more than 6,700 research grants around the world and across a broad spectrum of brain conditions, including addiction, ADHD, anxiety, autism, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, depression, eating disorders, OCD, post-traumatic stress, schizophrenia, as well as suicide prevention. Today, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Blair Simpson. Dr. Simpson is Professor of Clinical Psychiatry and Director of the Anxiety Disorders Clinic at Columbia University, New York State Psychiatric Institute. She was a 2010 BBRF Independent Investigator and a 2005 BBRF Young Investigator. Our webinar will begin with Dr. Simpson's presentation, which will then be followed by Q&A. To submit your questions, please use the Questions tab on the control panel on your screen. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time. Following the presentation, I'll ask as many as allotted in the time. And now, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Simpson. Blair, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you for inviting me to speak. And thank you to everyone who's listening today. I only wish we could see each other's faces. So as Jeff said, I'm Blair Simpson, and I direct the Center for OCD and Related Disorders at the New York State Psychiatric Institute, and I'm also a professor at Columbia University in the Department of Psychiatry. And my center focuses on improving lives of people with OCD, and we do this by conducting patient-oriented research that seeks to transform how we diagnose and treat OCD. And I will share some of this research today. Let me start by sharing who funds my research. So my work primarily is funded by the National Institutes of Mental Health, which is one of the institutes at the National Institutes of Health in the United States. And the data I will present today would not exist without this funding. I'm also very grateful for funding from foundations like BBRF and private philanthropy. And although this funding is usually much smaller than the types of grants that NIMH can give, this funding is extremely important because it enables researchers like myself to pilot new projects and test new ideas. And that's how you get pilot funding to be able to go in for larger grants through the federal government. I've also received some industry funding, but it's really important to understand industry primarily funds research that supports their products that they can commercialize, like a specific drug that they can sell. So even though there's a lot of funding in this research, it's much more narrow in scope because it's about their products, as I said. Whereas my research, we address questions that are patient, not product oriented. And that's why sources other than industry are so key. So I want to thank all my funders as well as to all who participated in our studies to help us better understand OCD. So let me start by taking a step back. Why do we do biomedical research? Why should anyone fund biomedical research? Why should a government like our government in the United States put money into funding this? And it's sort of a straightforward and simple answer. It's to transform how we diagnose and treat illness and to pave the way to early intervention and cures. biomedical research is how we're going to do something better tomorrow than we do today. This is what actually will make America healthy again, biomedical research, as well as people around the globe, of course. But there's a problem sometimes with research, and that's that there's a gap. Sometimes there can be a gap between the research that's done and what actually happens in clinical practice and what policies are there for the delivery of healthcare. And this is particularly a challenge with basic science. There can be a big gap. But what's in that gap? And what's in that gap, what fixes that gap, what bridges that gap is patient-oriented research. And this slide is just showing you what I mean by that. So for example, if they're basic science discoveries, let's say about how the brain works, about molecules in cells, cellular function, usually those occur, not always, but usually those occur in animal models. So the first thing that's really important is to translate those discoveries to humans and make sure that what we've discovered, let's say in an animal system, is relevant to us as humans. But that isn't going to get you to clinical practice. The next thing you've got to do is you've got to actually move what we know about the brain or cellular or molecular functioning to really understand the mechanisms of disease. And this means translating to studies on patients and identifying the mechanisms of what causes a certain disease, which can give you targets for treatment intervention. And there are many different types of studies that can do this. I'm just giving you some pictures of some, such as genetic studies. What's the genetic risk for different diseases? We've been using brain imaging a lot in psychiatry to try to understand how the brain is functioning, not only in healthy volunteers, but also in people with different diseases. And epidemiological studies can also help you pinpoint mechanisms of disease by looking at large populations and looking at risks between a disease and certain risk factors. But that doesn't get you to treatment. Let's say that those mechanisms of disease gets you to think about a new way you might treat an illness, or let's say just by chance you notice a drug that was made for a different condition is suddenly working in a new condition. You then have to test those treatments and make sure they're really working in the patient population that you are focused on. And that means doing clinical trials. And so testing and improving treatments, the methodology we use is clinical trials, whether it's psychotherapy we're studying, whether it's medications we're studying, whether it's devices. And finally, even that, clinical trials don't get you to changing and transforming clinical practice. Much of those treatments and that research can stay in research settings unless it's disseminated and implemented around the globe to real clinical practice. And that type of science is called implementation science. So this whole circle is what I call patient-oriented research and is what bridges the gap between science discoveries and changing clinical practice. And my research program encompasses all these different forms of research, but today I'm going to focus on a series of clinical trials that we've done and summarize in the process what these trials and other people's trials have taught us about treating OCD. I'm then going to tell you about an implementation science study that we're doing, which is how to bring evidence-based treatments to practice using an example of a project we're doing in New York State. And finally, I'll end with a neuroimaging study, which is to highlight not only what we know about what causes OCD, but how studies of mechanism like neuroimaging studies can lead to new targets for treatment development. Let me start though to make sure we're all on the same page. What is OCD and how do we treat it today? So the hallmarks of OCD are in the name. It's called obsessive-compulsive disorder, and the core features of OCD are obsessions, which are repetitive thoughts, images, or urges that a person finds intrusive and distressing, and compulsions, which are repetitive behaviors or mental acts. People can do rituals in their head as well. And these obsessions and compulsions are not, simple, minute problems. These symptoms are highly distressing, time-consuming, and impairing. And I have patients who are obsessing and compulsing hours a day, if not all day. And you can imagine that if you're doing that, it can really interfere with your social and emotional and family functioning. as well as your work functioning. So while all patients with OCD will have obsessions and compulsions, what makes one OCD patient look very different than another are what I call the associated features. So for example, people can have a real range of content and fears, and we as researchers tend to group these into large categories. One patient might have concerns about contamination, intrusive thoughts are going to get ill with a lot of washing compulsions. Another patient might have intrusive fears about harm befalling themselves or someone else with a lot of checking rituals. Another category of patients can be very concerned with symmetry and exactness, and they're ordering all day long. And there are other patients who can have taboo thoughts as well. And it isn't that you have only one type of symptom. Many patients have more than one, but we call these different symptom domains, if you will, symptom dimensions. And that can make one person with OCD look different than another. The other thing is that OCD patients can have different affects. While many have intense anxiety and panic, and can even have panic attacks if triggered by one of their OCD triggers, still other OCD patients might have a sense of it just doesn't feel right. And there's a sense of sort of I have to do something because this doesn't feel right, or even the strong sense of disgust. Another thing that distinguishes people with OCD is there's varying insight. While some patients can say, I know that these washing rituals don't make any sense. I know that this is irrational, but I can't stop it. While others can really believe that if they don't do that washing ritual, they might die. It's also true that insight can vary over the course of the illness. So, a lot of times kids, if they're getting OCD, they may not know what's real and what's not real, and they might really believe that their symptoms are real. And it's only with treatment or growing up, getting older, that they realize that it's OCD. And finally, OCD, while it can occur on its own, that does happen, it often co-occurs with other disorders. So in adults, the most common co-occurring disorders are other anxiety disorders or depressive disorders. Eating disorders often co-occurs with OCD, both bulimia and anorexia. In kids, you often see a triad, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD and tic disorders with OCD. And then, it's important for people who are working with patients with schizophrenia to know that, up to a quarter of patients with schizophrenia will have OCD symptoms, if not frank OCD. So it's all of this clinical heterogeneity that sometimes can make it difficult for people to recognize and treat OCD. The other thing I like to emphasize is how disabling OCD can be without treatment. So its lifetime prevalence is 2%. That's about twice as common as schizophrenia. So it's not the most common anxiety disorder, but it's more prevalent than schizophrenia. Half the cases start by age 19, whereas half the cases of major depression start at 32, and a quarter of the cases of OCD will start by age 14. Typically, when people start having OCD, they meet the diagnostic criteria. Typically, the course is chronic with waxing and waning, again, without treatment. And then if you look at epidemiological studies, if you have OCD, chances are you're going to have moderate to serious symptoms. That's what the epidemiological studies suggest. So if you add this all up, the prevalence, the age of onset, the chronic course, and the moderate to severe symptoms, again, this is what makes OCD disabling. The good news is we have 2 first-line treatments for OCD that we know work, and we know they work from clinical trials. And broadly speaking, these come in 2 categories. One is a class of medications that we call serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and they include clomipramine, which is an old-fashioned tricyclic antidepressant, but has very strong serotonin reuptake inhibition. And then the selective SRIs, probably you're familiar, or many in the audience are familiar with these because these are very common. It's fluoxetine, fluvoxamine, paroxetine, sertraline, citalopram, escitalopram. And we have clinical trials that show all of these work, just some are not FDA approved for OCD, probably because the companies didn't think they'd make enough money to go through the approval process because so many others had already been approved. The other treatment that we know work is a particular form of psychotherapy called cognitive behavioral therapy. And in OCD, a particular form of that, which is called different things in the literature. It's called exposure and response or ritual prevention. It's got a lot of different acronyms, EXRP, exposure therapy, ERP. You're going to hear me refer to it as exposure therapy or EXRP. And that's also been shown to be highly effective. And I'm going to show you data about that. Just to make sure we know what that therapy is, because it's really important if you're a patient listening, did you get this therapy? Because if you didn't get this therapy, this is the therapy you want to get, because this is the therapy with the best evidence. And I'm going to show you that in a second. So what is it? The key procedures are in the name. EX is for exposures and RP is for ritual prevention. So what a therapist does with you is makes a list of the things that really trigger your OCD. And they go from 0 to 100, and they usually start about 50, giving you an anxiety level of about 50, with 100 being your worst. And then in a very focused and structured way, you do exposures around things that trigger your anxiety, going up that hierarchy till you get to the top, while also not doing your rituals. And the goal is to disconfirm your fears, that you're sure that if you, for example, in New York City, if you have contamination concerns, many people don't want to touch the subway poles, to disconfirm that if you touch that pole, you're really going to get a life-threatening illness, and to challenge the distorted beliefs about risk. It's also to break the habit. Ritual prevention is to break the habit of ritualizing and avoiding. But obviously, the overall goal is to improve functioning and quality of life. And in the field, we all have a lot of ideas about what EXRP is doing at the level of the brain as well, but not proven yet. There are many different formats by which you can give EXRP, but a standard format that we've studied a lot is 2 sessions where you really plan the treatment together with your therapist, and then 15 structured exposure sessions. We like to do it at least twice a week or more for better outcome than once weekly. And a key part of this treatment is the daily homework. And you as a therapist also do home visits to promote generalization of the skills, because the goal isn't that the person can actually expose themselves in your office. The goal is that they really learn this treatment, learn the skills, and are using them in their everyday life. So I want to start by talking about clinical trials. And clinical trials, this is one major form of patient-oriented research. And what clinical trials do is they test what treatments work. This is exactly the question they're asking. And there are different designs for clinical trials, and they address slightly different questions. But I'm going to start with the simplest clinical trial. And this was a study led by Edna Foa, who's on the left, from the University of Pennsylvania, and Mike Leibowitz, who was my research mentor when I first came to Columbia as a postdoc. And the question was easy. The question was simple. What's the best treatment for OCD? Is it that medication that I just told you about? And in this study, they used clomipramine because that was approved at the time they started the study. Is it that cognitive behavioral therapy that I told you, that EXRP? Or maybe it's the combination. So what's a typical design of a clinical trial? You recruit a clinical population, in this case, adults with OCD. You randomly assign them to different treatments. And in this study, they assigned one group to the medication, one group to the therapy, one group to the combination, and one group to a pill placebo. And that's to keep everybody honest in the trial, so that there was a blind, if you will. You train the staff up to deliver the treatments that you want to compare. So the people who are delivering the treatment are expertly trained. And I had the great fortune of I'm a psychiatrist by training, so I was first trained up to deliver the medication. But when they needed a therapist on the study, I then had the opportunity to switch over and become a therapist on the study. So I got to see both treatments as they were delivered. But the key is you also train up raters who measure symptom change over time and who don't know how people are randomized, so that you actually can compare outcomes at the end using measures where someone isn't biased because they already know how patients were randomized. And I just want to highlight, this is a trial. Trials like this usually take 4 or 5 years. They cost several $1 million to run. Trials like this are what the National Institutes of Mental Health have funded, and this is how we have these data. So let me jump to the answer. So what is the best treatment for adults with OCD? I'm showing you the results of this trial. So on the y-axis here, we have OCD severity. This is using a scale commonly used in research called the Yale-Brown Obsessive-compulsive scale. The scale goes from 0 to 40. I'm showing you the mid part of the range, which is usually what we see in outpatients with OCD. 16 and above is when we recommend, as a clinician, we really recommend treatment. On the x-axis, you're seeing weeks of treatment. So what you're seeing is that we recruited over 100 adults with OCD, primary OCD. The group that was randomly assigned to pill placebo over 12 weeks had little change in symptoms. So you can see it's a straight line. The group that was randomly assigned to the medication, the SRI clomipramine, had a gradual decrease in symptoms over time, and that curve is exactly like the curve that gave clomipramine FDA approval for the treatment of OCD. But I really want to draw your attention to the two groups that got the cognitive behavioral therapy, one group with the medication and one group without. Notice the intense decrease of symptoms over the first 4 weeks. Now, it's important to know that the therapy in this study was delivered 5 days a week for 3 weeks, and then there were 2 home visits. And then there were 45-minute maintenance sessions out to week 12. And the reason for this is medication was already known to take at least 12 weeks to work. So it'd be unfair to compare these treatments at the 4-week mark because the medication would have barely had time to have an effect. So the goal was to compare the treatments out at week 12. So this rapid, intense therapy had 45-minute weekly sessions out to week 12. Now, I don't need to show you fancy statistics. I think your eye can show you the result itself. You can see that all of the active treatments are better than the pill placebo. Remember, lower is better. But even your eye can see that the 2 treatments with the therapy, with or without the medication, are better than the medication alone. So one of the things that this study really showed was the power of CBT for the treatment of primary OCD. But back then, and still today, most people get medication first, mostly because it's easier to access. And yet, if you look at this graph, if you look at the average of the people in this group, notice that the average is above that mark of 16. So on average, these people could have re-entered this trial at the end. They were better than where they started, but not better enough. So one of the interesting things about clinical trials is that one question often begets the next. And so obviously you're probably already wondering in the audience, well, what happens if you recruited people here who are already on medications and you then gave them the cognitive behavioral therapy? Could they get better still? So that was the next questions that we asked in a next series of clinical trials. So we first asked, is adding EXRP to a stable dose of medication better than adding a psychosocial control? And why would we do a study like that? That's to prove that it's the specific skills in EXRP that matter. Maybe all you need is a caring, thoughtful therapist who meets with you twice a week and your OCD would get better. So that was the point of this trial, once again, funded by the National Institutes of Mental Health. These data would not exist without that funding. And another trial, 5 years later, we studied, well, is adding EXRP to medication better than adding an antipsychotic medication? And why did we do that trial? Because that is what had been in the field. That's what psychiatrists typically did. If serotonin reuptake inhibitors didn't lead to enough symptom reduction, which most of the time they don't, what psychiatrists would be doing is adding an antipsychotic because clinical trials had shown that worked. So we now wanted to compare adding EXRP to a psychosocial control and in a separate trial, comparing EXRP to adding an antipsychotic medication. And the bottom line is, yes, adding CBT to medication for adults with OCD was better than the psychosocial control, much better, and better than the antipsychotic, adding the antipsychotic medication. And across both studies, done more than 5 years apart with completely different patients, completely different therapists, we found that about 2/3 of people who got EXRP added to their medication got better, and about 1/3 got well. And what I mean by that are minimal symptoms. And we were subsequently funded by NIMH to show that if you gave not 17 sessions of EXRP, but up to 25, you could get 2/3 of people well. So what's the take-home message from this whole series of trials, both the trials that I've just mentioned to you that we've done, as well as trials that other people have done? And the take-home message is that the class of medications, SRIs, they're effective for some, but response is usually partial. That's a good response. Partial response is a good response in OCD. We don't know why, but that's the result. What do we know from these clinical trials about EXRP? It's effective for more people than medication, but a key thing here is patient adherence. And I don't have the time to show you these trials that we've done here, funded in part by philanthropy and funded in part by NIMH, is that patient adherence predicts acute outcome, patient adherence to EXRP predicts 6-month outcome, and in particular, early adherence can actually forecast how you're going to do. So a therapist can know how you're going to do at the end of the 2nd week of therapy just by how quickly you start to adhere. And then what we also know is that if you combine these two treatments, you can get 40% to minimal symptoms with only 17 sessions. And as I told you in a next study, we also, if you give the people up to 25, you can get 2/3 of people well. But this led to the following question. Why is it only 40%? Who gets that good benefit and who doesn't? And we answered that question in that trial. And once again, it's patient adherence. That's what matters the most, not severity of symptoms, patient adherence. And then the second question is that patients asked us once we showed them these results. Once they're on an SRI, they get the addition of EXRP and they're feeling better. The first thing our patients ask us is, can they then stop their SRI? And what we discovered in that trial is some can and some can't. And once again, it's thanks to NIH funding that we even have these data. So it's clinical trials like this, all sorts of different clinical trials that leads us to put together treatment algorithms. And I'm showing you a treatment algorithm for adults. All sorts of the same clinical trials have been done for kids. And by the way, the results are very similar to what I just showed you in kids about the power of EXRP for the treatment of OCD in kids and the typical partial response of medication in kids. And that combining them sometimes is what kids need best. So what you're seeing here is in the white boxes are what we consider today for both adults and kids, the first line treatments for OCD. And so if someone is listening and has OCD and hasn't had CBT or EXRP, this is the most effective treatment that we have. This is a really good thing for you to seek. And when you get the standard dose, which is that 17 session and it's not enough, we increased the dose, as I just told you, giving people just another 8 sessions, got even more people well. And we also really focus on enhancing patient adherence, given the data that we have. If you're on a medication and you're on a low dose and you're not having side effects, one of the things that we do there is we increase the dose because some people, that's all they need to get more effect. But let's say the first-line treatments don't work. There are clinical trials that have looked at second-line treatments in the case that you don't have a medication response at all, or you have a partial medication response. There are now a lot of other treatments that we're looking at, which I'm putting in the yellow box, which are experimental treatments that people are looking at and studying. And when everything fails, and sometimes everything fails, it's not common, but sometimes it happens. This is when OCD is a condition where people consider neurosurgical interventions, and that can be lesions or that can be deep brain stimulation. So one of the things I want to encourage people listening on this call, which is there are many trials in progress. There are trials of ketamine, there are trials of cannabinoids, there are trials of anti-inflammatories, there's trials of psilocybin. People are studying how to improve EXRP by increasing technology and access, enhancing learning, intensive formats, as well as testing new therapies. And there's a lot of work going on with transcranial magnetic stimulation. And all of these trials that are in progress are listed on clinicaltrials.gov, and you can go there and see all these different trials. And if you're eligible for those trials and you want to try something new, they can be a really great way to try something new while actually also helping to advance the science. But again, I want to remind everybody, just being in the white boxes and doing those really well, having a really good therapist, really adhering to the treatment, whether it's medication or CBT. If your primary problem is OCD, half of you should be getting well. So that leads me to two challenges in the field, which allows me to introduce patient-oriented research beyond clinical trials. So the first challenge is that most with OCD don't receive first-line treatments. The two treatments that I just told you about. I just told you we can get half of people well, and most people don't receive that. How ridiculous is that? And why is that? Well, it gets complicated. Sometimes the problem is the patient doesn't know they have OCD, so they don't know how to ask for the help they need, or they don't come for treatment. And sometimes in many parts of the world, stigma is a real issue, and so coming for treatment is really hard. Sometimes it's the clinician. The patient comes for treatment and tells what the problems they're having, but the clinician doesn't recognize OCD or misdiagnoses it, or doesn't treat it properly, doesn't know the right dose of medication or the right therapy to deliver. And sometimes it's the system, right? Sometimes our systems of care, and this is an issue in the United States where we don't have national health services, so different systems can do many different things. The system of care is not offering what's evidence-based treatment, or our insurance policies don't cover it. And it's a particular problem in the public mental health system. So it's this challenge that led my center to partner with implementation scientists who are at the Center for Practice Innovation, and to approach New York State and the Office of Mental Health to see if we could do something about this starting in New York State. And the goal of that initiative, we've called it Impact OCD, and it's to increase awareness about OCD across New York State, and also to build the capacity of community clinicians to diagnose and treat individuals with OCD. Our team started small with a few people from my center, people from the Center for Practice Innovation, with Sapana Patel being the lead here, as well as with Bob Myers at the New York State Office of Mental Health, who was a true champion from an early phase of this work. And the work has occurred in phases. But let me say first, what is implementation science? So this is a very different type of patient-oriented research than I just described, very different than clinical trials. Here, the focus is not on testing whether treatments work. We know treatments work. Here, the focus is how to bring these treatments that work to be used in community practice. So one design would be to go to community practice and engage the stakeholders. This would be the clinicians, the clinical supervisors, the administrators of the clinics. Ask what they would need to start a new treatment in their clinic. provide trainings to fit that need, and then you study the success of your training. So in the case of Impact OCD, for example, at the end of your trainings, do more clinicians know how to diagnose and treat OCD? And the goal here when it's research, like Impact OCD is research, is not only to bring that evidence-based treatment to that particular health system. So for us, it's the public mental health system in New York that we're starting to work in, but really it's to create a broader model that can be used by other systems. And our hope is that we can create a model in New York State that could be used by states across the country. This is the team now. As you can see, one of the things that's really fun about implementation science is this team grows and grows because that's the whole point, is to engage all your stakeholders. So as I said, Impact OCD has occurred in phases. So in phase 1, we were really focused on workforce development because we realized we had to do a lot of work educating clinicians and clinics, what is OCD and what are evidence-based treatments. In phase 2, we continued that workforce development. New York is 19 million people, so it's a big state, but we also added a focus on early detection. And finally, in phase 3, which is where we are now, we're working on building the capacity for community clinicians to treat. So let me just tell you briefly about these phases. So again, as I said, you engage your stakeholders, you find out what they know and what they want to know, and you build your trainings around that. So in phase 1 in workforce development, what our stakeholders told us is they wanted e-training modules. They didn't want to come to classes in person. They wanted training modules that they could use anytime at their convenience. And they particularly wanted certain topics, not only how to detect and diagnose OCD with tips and tools from us, but they also wanted a focus on kids, which we gave them, and also a focus on differentiating OCD from schizophrenia, or how do you treat OCD when it co-occurs with schizophrenia, which, as I told you, can occur not infrequently. They also wanted to hear more about the two main treatments, both the exposure and response prevention and the pharmacological treatments. So we made all these modules for them. Our stakeholders also wanted online toolkits. They wanted things right at their fingertips that they could use. So the providers, for example, wanted the criteria for OCD. They wanted treatment algorithms. They wanted severity measures that they could use to assess symptoms. So we put that all accessible to them in a toolkit. And these are public facing. Anybody can access them. The providers also wanted resources they could actually give to individuals and their families. So we created toolkits for individuals and families as well as links to other materials. And finally, they wanted expert consultations with our team. And so for clinicians in the public health system here in New York, we've been able to have our team do online consultations on assessment, psychotherapy, and medication. And so the outcomes here, right, this is what we did, but the outcomes here, again, very different than clinical trials. It's how many people have used our modules, and it's over 740 providers to date. How many people have used our toolkits? Well, there are over 6,000 people have looked at the provider toolkit, and over 2,500 have looked at the family and individual toolkit. And we've done to date over 120 consultations, and those numbers just continue to grow. The next phase was focusing on early detection. And here, once again, we engaged our stakeholders. We started with 5 clinics in particular clinics called Certified Community Behavioral Health Clinics. And these are a model of clinic that are not only expanding across New York State, but also across the country. So we thought anything we developed here potentially could be useful. The model we developed could be useful across the country. And here we engaged the stakeholders in these clinics and asked, what do you need? How can we help you detect OCD? And what they really wanted was a simple tool that was embedded in their workflow. They didn't want extra trainings. They didn't want an extra form. So we developed and implemented a screening tool in these 5 clinics. They also wanted online support from us for us to be available if they needed us, which we were. And if they found cases of OCD and they didn't have the resources in their clinic, they wanted us to help find referrals, because there's nothing worse as a clinician than to make a diagnosis, know there's good treatments out there, and not be able to help your patient find them. And so, so far we've trained 100 clinicians across these 5 clinics, and they've screened over 3,000 people for OCD. And the rate of diagnosis of OCD across these clinics before we started was 0.4%. So not even 1 out of 100, right? 0.4 out of 100. And now it's 1.5 out of 100. And hopefully we keep growing this pilot screening project and get those numbers up even more. And finally, in phase 3, now we're working on building the capacity to treat. And treating with SRIs is quite easy and straightforward. That isn't complicated to teach people. But teaching clinicians how to deliver EXRP with fidelity, that's more of the challenge. But these clinicians want to learn. And so this is actually the project we're doing now. And again, the goal is to develop a model for how to do this and test it in New York State. And with success, can it be exported then to other states? And it's, to me, this is a really important project, because if it's successful, it would create a model that would greatly increase access to EXRP, our most potent treatment for OCD. So we have a grant with an outstanding score from rigorous NIMH review, and we're waiting to hear if we're funded. But here's the challenge of being a researcher. It's a key moment. If they fund us, we're all ready to start. And if they don't fund us, we're stopped in our tracks. So please root for us. And what's the ultimate goal of this type of research? For me, the ultimate goal is to get early detection and access to evidence-based treatment together to lead to early intervention for OCD. As I told you at the beginning, half of cases start by age 19. A quarter of cases start by age 14. I can see an adult in their 30s or 40s, and I can help them with their OCD symptoms, but I can't give them their life back. I can't get them back to college and graduating from college with their peer group. I can't get them into, back to an early, romantic relationship. I can't give them all that developmental trajectory that people should be on just by dropping their symptoms as an adult. So I've become a real proponent and champion of how do we get early detection and access to treatment to people in the first year that they're diagnosed, not waiting years and years. So that leads me to the second challenge. So I just told you the positive story. We have treatments that work. They can help half of people, but the challenge is many people can't access them. So the research we do is implementation science to try to increase access to evidence-based care. The second challenge, though, is why is it half? Why don't our treatments work for most everyone? And that's really an interesting challenge that we don't know the answer of. There's some people where the first-line treatments don't work, and we move on to augment their medication or add other treatments, and that helps them. But as you saw in my treatment algorithm, at the very bottom, when nothing works, and unfortunately that happens for some people, we're left with neurosurgery as an intervention. So how can this be? And that really leads to the fundamental question, which is, what causes OCD? Because maybe if we better understood what caused it, we could understand why our treatments work for some but not all, and we could develop even better treatments for the people for whom our current treatments aren't enough. So what causes OCD? So the way I think about this, I think about it as 2 ideas. The first thing is how to answer that question is what I call pathophysiology. How does the brain produce obsessions and compulsions? And what do I mean by that? The fact that I'm talking to you today, my brain is enabling me to produce that speech, right? So if I have obsessions and compulsions, well, then something in my brain is producing those obsessions and compulsions. And the working model we have is that specific brain circuits aren't functioning properly. And frankly, that's the working model we have for all psychiatric diseases. It's just that different circuits are it's just what's not functioning are different circuits. We also know from a huge body of literature that I don't have time to review for you that there are neurocognitive and neurobehavioral alterations in people with OCD when you compare them to healthy volunteers. And that can include alterations in how they process threat or extinguish fear. That can be their balance between goal-directed and habitual behavior. That can be their ability to inhibit responses or have what we call cognitive control over their thoughts, and also reward processing. But this is a very different answer than what I call etiology, right? Which is, etiology is, well, how did the brain develop those alterations? And that's a different question, right? And what we know, again, from a body of work is that there is genetic risk to OCD, and we see that in particular in twin studies. There also are cases of new onset OCD after infectious agents, and there's a hypothesis around autoimmune mechanisms. There have been new onset cases of people in their 50s or 60s after neurological insults, and also new onset OCD after severe trauma, and in that sense, an environmental cause. We also know from a huge body of brain imaging studies in people with OCD compared to people who don't have OCD is that there are alterations in multiple brain circuits. And I'm showing you a picture of this on the screen. This is sort of color-coded to show you different what are called cortical striatal thalamic circuits that subserve different functions in the brain. And there's evidence from different brain imaging studies of alterations in these circuits. But there's a problem, and I should say, and these circuits are known to subserve those neurocognitive and behavioral functions that we also see alterations in. So it makes sense, right? Alterations in a brain circuit leading to neurobehavioral alterations that in some way we don't know leads to obsessions and compulsions. But there's a problem with these neuroimaging studies, right? Which is neuroimaging studies are a snapshot in time. So one question is, what's cause and what's effect? So if you see an alteration in the brain, is that the symptoms causing the change in the brain, or is that the brain causing the symptoms? There's a second question that I think about a lot. Do I think all my OCD patients have exactly the same brain dysfunction? No, because as I told you at the beginning, there's some heterogeneity in the clinical presentation. And I bet at the end of the day, when we really understand this, there's going to be some heterogeneity in the brain alterations. And the final thing is, are neuroimaging findings robust and reproducible? And that's a really important point, because if you're going to go use a brain imaging finding as a target for new treatment development, you want to know you're going to find that same target robustly and in a reproducible way. So that was the neuroimaging study that we decided to start with. And the goal was to identify robust signatures in the brain of OCD. And we decided to do this study globally because it's the hardest scientific test of the question. So what we wanted to do, so for example, here I sit in New York City, right, with my team, and we wanted to recruit people with OCD, clinically assess them, have them do neurocognitive tasks and image their brain. And the idea was, well, if I find an OCD signature in New York City, well, so should a team in the Netherlands who does exactly the same things, a team in India who does exactly the same thing, a team in South Africa, or a team in Brazil. And this is this global study that I call, again, funded by the National Institutes of Mental Health. And so we recruited a large sample of adults with OCD, unaffected siblings, and healthy volunteers, and we matched them on age, sex, and educational level. And we measured clinical symptoms and neurocognitive tasks and neuroimaging measures in their brain, looking at those circuits that I just highlighted before. And what's the goal of this research? The idea of this research is maybe there are different alterations that explain some of the different clinical presentations, and maybe that means different treatments might be better for different people. So that's this idea of toward precision psychiatry. So here are the different circuits, and this is sort of a heuristic device to say, well, if you've got more alterations in the frontal limbic circle, the red one, for example, maybe there you're going to have more anxious symptoms. And if you have more alterations in the dorsal cognitive circuit, which is the blue one, maybe there you see more executive dysfunction, and maybe that leads to slightly different ways to tailor your treatment for better outcome for you. So that leads me back to patient-oriented research, and I'm just going to finish up now. What I told you about is how clinical trials are used to test treatments. I told you how implementation science is used to bring evidence-based care to community practice, and how studies of mechanism, in this case, I told you about a neuroimaging study, is looking for novel treatment targets and ways to tailor treatments for better outcomes for individual patients. And this is what is needed to bring this basic science discoveries to clinical practice and transform care. Now, patient-oriented research takes a village with all sorts of different expertise. It takes funding, as I've talked to you along the way. And it also takes a team, and I'm very grateful to my team here at the New York State Psychiatric Institute and Columbia University. And I just wanted to end with a perspective of someone who's been in the field of OCD now for over 2 decades. I've seen with my own eyes how research has led to improved outcomes for OCD, and I see very exciting developments on the horizon. Thus, I ask all who's listening, if you care about OCD and better treatments tomorrow than we have today, please join me in advocating for patient-oriented research, because this is the research that can translate basic science discoveries to clinical practice and help us make even more rapid progress than we have to date. So with that, thank you all for listening. And Jeff, I'm happy to take a few questions.
Blair, thank you for an outstanding presentation, just a great overview, so much information in a user-friendly way for a lay public, just really outstanding. And your passion for this comes across so clearly. So thank you for all that you do for joining us today. I want to speak about a couple of people asked related to the important topic you brought up about adherence to treatment. And if somebody, because of their symptoms, have a hard time doing the CBT treatment, the exposure treatment, how do you go about working with that?
Yes, so one is figuring out what's getting in the way, right? So you want to really work with a person to, well, first of all, what I was taught is you stop treatment. Because if someone isn't adhering and a therapist is just sort of beating them over the head, everyone can just start to feel very discouraged. And that's not any way to actually get change, right? Which is stop the treatment and really focus in, what are the obstacles that are getting in the way? Are the exposures too hard? Is the ritual prevention or the demands too high? Can you actually tailor the treatment at the beginning to get them to actually see that it will work, but start a little bit smaller, a little bit more gently, right? You still got to get to the top, but you got to make sure that someone sees that it's going to work before they have that confidence. A second one that we see also is sometimes this is where we use medication. Someone comes to us for CBT or EXRP treatment, but their symptoms are just so high, it's really hard for them to focus on the therapy. So by putting them on medication, maybe it's not for life, maybe it's for a period of time to drop the symptoms so that they could imagine doing the EXRP. That's another strategy that we use. A third big one is support. So having support people around them, and so having an environment, whether it's the family or the work environment that's supporting their doing the treatment. We also sometimes use more frequent sessions or even residential treatment so that someone can go into a residential setting and 24/7, sort of, it's almost like boot camp to get to another place. Having said that, are there people, have I seen people who don't want to do EXRP and really don't want to do it? I have, and I believe that patients should have choice and patients have preferences. And so as long as they know it's one of the most effective treatments they have, but if they choose not to do it at that point in time, you know, I honor that decision. What's interesting is I've had patients come back a year later, 2 years later, and say they're now ready. Because the medication, while usually well tolerated, You know, people have sleeping problems, people gain weight, people have sexual dysfunction. You know, it's hard to take SRIs for your entire life. And so sometimes it's about people finding the motivation in their outside life to decide they really want to take this on. I hope that helps.
Very much so, and it really shows that clinically there are approaches to take when the usual may not work. You basically go with where the person is and meet them there and try to help them with that, which I think
And
is
just to let
extremely
you know,
important.
Jeff, that one of the NARCED grants that you funded me on, my first one, was actually looking at patient adherence in OCD. So thank you so much for BBRF.
You're welcome, and thank you for doing it and all that you do. I want to also focus on the importance of early intervention that you emphasize, early diagnosis and intervention. Are there things that parents or teachers can be looking for in adolescents or even younger children that may show early signs that maybe needs an evaluation?
Yeah, so I mean, this is where we want to go with Impact OCD. We've started with adults, we've started in clinics, but eventually we want to get to kids in the pediatric population, and as you say, to pediatricians and to teachers, and to help families with this. So, look, I'm a big believer. I mean, avoidance is bad. I'm just gonna put it out there. When you start seeing a kid starting to avoid stuff, you as a parent should become like, huh, what's going on here? Now, sometimes, right, it's good, you know, it's like healthy to avoid, you know, difficult people or dangerous places. I'm not talking about that type of avoidance, but if you start watching your kid, you know, not wanting to go to school or avoiding, you know, certain situations, that should be a red flag to you. And rest assured, it doesn't mean medication. In fact, the first line treatments for anxiety and OCD in kids is cognitive behavioral therapy. That is what the recommendations suggest, because the treatment is so powerful and you don't have to worry about cognitive behavioral therapy in kids. So I'm a big believer that it's better to get someone evaluated sooner rather than later, because in the field of anxiety and OCD, we're lucky. We have very powerful psychotherapies that can really help people. And frankly, there's sort of a skill set for life, right? Which is, you can see OCD as, well, I'm exposing myself to what I fear, but learning to master it and trying not to do rituals which are dysfunctional. But the more someone does it, the more someone can build resilience. And life has all sorts of disruptors in it for all of us, right? And so I view these as larger skills that can really help someone deal with the ups and downs of life, not only OCD and anxiety.
Very, very important point. And finally, one last question. If we were going to be having this conversation in 5 years from now, 10 years from now, where do you see, where will we be as a field in terms of helping people with OCD?
Well, I can tell you where I hope we'll be. But a
Okay,
lot of
good.
that depends on what happens with funding. I think many of your listeners are aware that we're in a very difficult moment in the USA with, you know, everything I presented today. If the federal government here wasn't funding my research, I would have none of these answers for anybody in the audience. And so we're at a very sort of critical point about what's going to happen with the federal budget in the United States for funding research. And it's not that it's the only budget. Other countries also fund research, but the National Institutes of Health has had a huge portfolio. And so it's not only about OCD I worry about all of our psychiatric illnesses, frankly, cancer research and diabetes research and it all. But what I hope is, let's say we have the funding. Let's say we have the funding and it's, you know, and wherever it comes from, then I actually think really understanding the genetic environmental risk, the cofactors between those two things and developmental trajectory, boy, do I hope we understand that story. Because if you have really bad genes, you might get it anyway, but sometimes you might just be at risk and you might not get it, you know, and what protects you as well as what triggers you, right? I think that's really important research. I would love to see studies of early intervention so that we actually go in after a year and see whether we get much better outcomes. There's a ton of work on novel drugs. There's a ton of work on transcranial magnetic stimulation. All of that we're going to know a lot more about in 10 years.
Great. Well, all that you do, all that you're going to continue to do, thank you so much. And thank you for joining us and sharing all this information today. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it.
Well, thank you to everyone who's listening. Thank you to everyone who showed up to listen. And I only, as I said, I only wish we could all see each other's faces.
Yep. Well, future technology, we will. I also want to thank everybody for joining us and ask people to please consider making a donation to BBRF today. As Blair said, the funding is so important for the continuation of research. 100% of every dollar donated for research to BBRF is invested in our research grants. We're able to do this because our operating expenses are covered by separate foundation grants. This means that when you donate $1 for research, that dollar goes directly to the scientist. Please make a gift. Visit bbrfoundation.org or call us at 1-800-829-8289. This webinar has been recorded. If you missed any portion or would like to share it, please visit the events and webinar page on our website. And again, please join us on August 12th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time when Dr. Mark Weintraub, Assistant Professor of Psychiatry at UCLA Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior, will present Improving Psychotherapy for Mood Disorders. Thank you. And remember, together we can dramatically improve the lives of those living with mental illness and enable more people to live full, happy, and productive lives. Take care.